Hi, you're watching Hindustan Times, and I'm Aditi Prasad. A lot of things have changed in this post-pandemic era. This includes, of course, but is not restricted to what we are eating, how people eat, and in general, the food consumption patterns. Now, Deloitte has come out with a report that throws light on exactly how Indians have been choosing their food and what the trends look like for the future. I'm joined by Anand Ramanathan, a partner in Deloitte India, to get more on the same. Anand, what are the key findings of the report that you can share with us?
Thank you, Aditi. Uh, from a future of food standpoint, what we did was to look at the food ecosystem and break it up into four different parts, right? So, right on top, we have the consumer. And from a consumption standpoint, if you look at what is changing, the food pyramid itself has changed in terms of what people want to consume and the income and affordability and various other financial outcomes driving consumption. We've seen that there is more focus now on oil seeds, on pulses, while traditionally there was a lot of focus on cereals, sugar, etc. Similarly, if I look at animal protein, dairy, meat, all of these are growing spaces. And we also have greater levels of organization now, where there is branded play in many unorganized sectors, right? So if I were to look at staples like poha, dalia, all of it is getting organized in within brands slowly. And hence, these are going to be the key changes which are going to drive consumption. And what happened during the pandemic was that some of this got accelerated, the need for a brand, and hence the need for looking at health, at wellness, at convenience. So ready to cook, ready to eat started growing much faster. In fact, India used to export a lot of frozen food, and a lot of that got shifted to domestic consumption itself. Similarly, we've seen more focus on food, not just from a nutrition standpoint, but also from an overall wellness standpoint. And hence, we've had new products evolve in the marketplace, which are positioned on things like weight management, sports nutrition, a bunch of different areas which traditionally were not associated with food. So that's on the consumption side. Similarly, on the manufacturing side, we are seeing that there is increased competition now from the private labels of modern trade and e-commerce itself, and hence manufacturers are focusing a lot more on cost. Typically, in food, about 50 to 60% of the cost comes from the cost of raw material, right? And therefore, how do you
Hmm.
source more effectively? How do you look at things like packaging, for example, where we have seen inflationary trends? How is that going to be an area where companies can look at redoing things and looking at the way they package the product itself? And also from building a farmer linkages, right? Because you're able to control your cost better in terms of sourcing when you have the right farmer linkages. All of this is intermediated by technology. Now you have a lot of technology, whether it is machine intelligence, looking at industry 4.0, looking at traceability systems for using blockchain, for example. So there are a bunch of technologies which are helping all of these different brands to become that much more efficient. And finally, from a farm sector standpoint, and logistics included within that, we're seeing that there is a greater focus on sustainability. We have limited resources, so how do you make land and water resources more productive, and at the same time how do you ensure that farming practices are sustainable and we don't degrade the environment, because India is definitely going to need to become a lot more productive, and hence intensification technologies in terms of getting more yield from the same level of resource inputs are going to be areas of focus. Automation, given the large challenges we have around labor, and hence from a farm sector standpoint, great focus on productivity and yield enhancement, right? So this is
All
just
right.
to give you a
You
broad
you
sense
yeah,
of play
you've
of
given me a bird's eye view and a very you've covered a lot of points. Let's just take one by one, and let me start with consumption. In terms of consumption during the pandemic, you are saying in the post-pandemic era, people are eating more healthy from what I understood from what you were telling me. Is this because of the pandemic in general, or is it what is driving this shift towards healthier eating?
So there are a couple of key drivers for health and wellness becoming of more importance during the pandemic, right? So the first factor driving it is primarily realization that health is really important and it can derail a lot of other other experiences that a consumer has. And hence, across the board, we've seen greater levels of focus and involvement also, given that many households started looking at preparation of food themselves when there was a lockdown and when help wasn't available. They also saw what was going into their food, right? And hence, there was a greater level of awareness in terms of how to look at healthier recipes and where is it that they can augment the wellness quotient of what they eat, right? So that is one big driver. The second
Right.
big driver is also availability of options, right? Because you had time, and hence, given that there was a greater availability of time, a lot of things could go back to first principles. And hence, on the back of that, we saw a variety of new ingredients being explored and used, right? Because ultimately, there were very few avenues for entertainment during certain times within the period of the pandemic, right? And hence, food
Hmm.
was the one big area where there could be an experience, and it was an entertainment option at home, right? So people started experimenting more. You saw trends towards baking at home, for example, right? All of these kind of evolved during the pandemic. So the second key driver was enhanced availability and of time, and hence the availability of the right ingredients to play around with food recipes.
Okay. And, also in terms of, do you also see, does the report also see a shift towards more organic foods? And, how is that playing out? What is the scope of such products?
So there's certainly a big market for organic food, right? But with organic, the challenge is more on supply, right? How do you ensure that the claims that you make on organic are genuine and reliable and true? And hence, what we've seen with organic food is traceability becomes really important. And hence, if you have right visibility on how organic food is grown and processed, then that creates a market for organic food, right? But even beyond organic food, what we've also seen evolve is to look at substitutes, right? Many times, because you want to be more sustainable in your consumption, you want to be more healthy in your consumption, there are also a whole host of other areas like plant proteins, for example, right? That has seen a lot of growth during the period of the pandemic because it is a sustainable form of consumption and people wanted that option to be available, right? So many of these spaces, which traditionally were very small niches, have seen substantial growth during the pandemic.
What there is also a role that technology is playing in this entire thing. You pointed out when you were talking, you initially you was spoke about the role of technology. You spoke about how technology is driving a lot of these consumption choices today, and especially in the post-pandemic era, where people are now more digitally savvy. People have learned to order their food online rather than sort of go and buy it from the local kirana shop. That has happened a lot. Even many local kirana shops, changing with the times, have started having trying to have apps and stuff so that people can just order online. Apart from obviously the big businesses, the big chains that are already there, like a big bazaar or a food bazaar and so on and so forth. Now, what do you think? How has the role of technology? How has technology contributed to the changing consumption patterns?
Right. So you did mention about the front end side of things, right? So direct to customer is a big area of investment by most brands and retailers. That is because it gives you data on how end consumers consume, right? And therefore, to that extent, you're able to understand consumer behavior more effectively, and hence the need for investing in technology to understand what is it that people want, what are their preferences, what are they buying, how can I sell more depending on what they've bought in the past, etc. Right? And therefore, this gives a great amount of control for a brand to understand its consumers. So we've seen brands invest in direct to consumer, which is largely around looking at, say, omni-channel, right? Irrespective of which channel the consumer buys, can I provide the same experience? A lot of people go online to search. And during the pandemic, we've seen that physical distribution was put under some amount of strain. And hence, how is it that you can explain your product and make the features, attributes, benefits communicated that much more effectively to consumers? Again, technology interface there. And we also saw technology play a role in making the right product available because supply chains got disrupted. And hence, how is it that I can make the most of the product availability that I have and take it to places where I can get the best margins, right? And hence, one view of inventory became very important, where a lot of brands as well as retailers invested on understanding where their stock is and to make it available at the right time in the right place, right? So these are all areas where things like, for example, if I were to look at AI or ML, a lot of algorithms kind of dictated what kind of planning, forecasting that companies needed to do. And hence, AI was a big area from a demand planning and forecasting standpoint. The second big area was to look at the whole cloud revolution. Given that there's the need to analyze a lot of data, cloud provided a effective mechanism where they could look at converting capex into opex, right? No longer needed to invest in data servers. Instead, look at an opex model where you're able to look at insights and capture insights which are relevant and analyze huge amounts of data using cloud as a platform. So that's the second big driver in technology. And then we had certain critical areas of industry 4.0, right? Which is everything to do with sensors to track what is it that you're growing, how effectively you're growing it, what is it that you're producing, when is the next maintenance scheduling required, how is it that you can reduce electricity and water costs while manufacturing, and also from a supply chain standpoint, understand where your inventory is lying through the use of sensors, right? So I think industry 4.0 was the third big area where we saw a lot of focused investments which helped in improving productivity right from the agri inputs and the farm sector all the way up to retail and the consumer.
I can't help, since we're talking about, improving, food chain efficiency, and we're talking about the manufacturing side of it, the supply side of the entire food chain, so to speak. I can't help but not ask about the farm laws, right? So the farm laws made it very easy, which have now been repealed, had sort of made it easy for the manufacturers, for the manufacturers to connect with the farmers, a direct source directly from the farm sector, so to speak. Now with the repeal of the farm laws, do you believe that sort of upsets the apple cart a little, going forward? Where How do you see this panning out?
So sure, I mean the farm laws would have helped in making the food supply chain a lot more efficient, but it's still an opportunity, right? If you look at supply and demand in India, what had happened is traditionally farmers, because of MSP, used to grow crops which are things like sugar, for example, or wheat, rice, etc., where they're assured of a certain MSP, right? But if you look at where the Indian market is evolving, there's a lot more focus on horticulture, on pulses and oilseeds, where we have huge import bills, right? And therefore, the farm laws would have helped match supply and demand dynamics, right? And that is something which can also be done if we look at interventions even outside of policy. So, can we start spreading information more effectively in terms of where the demand for products lie, and therefore help farmers also complement their existing crops with a whole host of crops which are relevant from a market standpoint, right? So, that's going to be one area which is really critical. The second is, like you correctly mentioned, this is the window of opportunity, right? Where every large agri input player or a food processing player is looking at building farmer databases, right? To
Right.
understand who is growing, what does he need, and how is it that we can cater to his needs more effectively. So you have an entire field force now which looks at developing relationships with farmers. And again, there's a lot of technology there where we've used the learnings from the Salesforce automation and the dealer management system and applied it at the back end in terms of a farmer management system, right? So that's going to be the second big opportunity. The laws would have helped in kind of accelerating this connect with the farmer and procuring directly from them. But I think, again, clever use of technology along with the right investments in people can also further facilitate better linkages where there is more transparency in pricing, which can improve the way companies source from farmers. So even if they're not able to directly source from farmers, they will be able to have better control over pricing through understanding the intermediary ecosystem and partnering with them to give better realizations to farmers.
Right. My last question to you, and I won't take up much more of your time now, it will be, I don't know whether your report covers it, but about the inflationary trends that we really see right now in the food sector, particularly. You know, the pandemic or poor weather conditions or whatever reasons have sort of pushed up food prices, not just in India, but in many other countries. But talking about India in specific, how do you see this food inflation trend playing out in the near and distant future?
So there will be inflationary pressure in food, right? Why does that happen? Food inflation is typically driven by how supply keeps in step with demand, right? And you have yourself mentioned it. A lot of countries, especially in the Indian Ocean Rim region, right from Africa to Middle East to Southeast Asia, during the pandemic, realized that they needed to become more secure from a food standpoint, right? And therefore there is going to be a lot of demand for the commodity space from this entire region, right? And India is blessed with a lot of agroclimatic zones, and therefore, while we help some of these countries develop processing capability, we will still be a big source of supply, right?
Right.
Especially when it comes to fresh produce and horticulture and areas like that, right? So there will be a lot of demand, and for supply to keep in step with demand always takes a certain lag, right, in terms of time,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
information has to flow through a pretty a layered system, right, where there are a lot of tiers. So to that extent, we will see inflation on commodities continue. Second, there's been a lot of disruption in logistics, right? And therefore, when you look at global production itself, you will see a lot of countries focus on becoming secure from a food standpoint, right? And therefore, there's going to be again the inefficiencies which come from a lack of free flow of goods because of constraints around logistics and supply chain. So that's going to be another driver. And the third, fuel is always going to impact something like food, right? And therefore, a lot of the inflationary behavior in food will also be linked to how fuel behaves, right? And these are going to definitely put pressure on other areas also, like things like packaging, for example. So we will again see some short-term impact and inflationary pressure in food.
Great. So to sum up, your report, Future of Food, literally talks about an increase in the uptake of proteins, a growing necessity for food safety, need for traceability, as you were pointing out, and to sort of get a local support. So there are clear opportunities there for private players, and there are clear insights, of course, into how India has changed its eating habits due to the pandemic. The shift is small, but definitely significant enough to deserve an entire report from you. Now, technology, of course, has been a key enabler in this, and I think it would not be wrong to say that the food sector per se is at a transformational moment, and really. The future of India, food in India. I think food security is really such a huge point right now, not just for India, for, as you said, many other nations. Uh, uh, and going forward, I think in your one line assessment of how food security in situation in India is going to be playing out in the near term.
Yes, so food is going to be very aspirational, right? And at the same time, very local. And we're going to have a lot of technology intermediate this gap between aspiration and localness in food, right? So that's going to be the key of the future of food going forward, both in India as well as all the countries that India supplies to.
All right. Thank you so much for speaking to us and giving us time to explain to us exactly how eating and consumption habits have been changing as the pandemic was raging all around us and possibly still is. And for years to come, we don't know how long it's going to remain like this, but at least we've started eating healthier. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Aditi. Pleasure speaking to you. Thanks a lot.